The person who says the most is not always the one who is most heard. Did you observe that? The person who talks too much at meetings, family discussions, or even casual conversations tends to lose the audience's interest. On the other hand, the person who listens and waits for the right opportunity to speak frequently produces a stillness that is more impactful than any yell. It's no accident that Plato and Schopenhauer both considered this concept. Plato said, "Now, consider the lion on the savannah. It doesn't scream without cause. Instead, it silently watches, closely observing every action, and only attacks when triumph is assured." Self-control like this is becoming more and more uncommon in humans. Talking has become mandatory these days. Many people say anything they can out of fear of being overlooked or falling behind. However, what if you need to be silent in order to be taken seriously? You'll see today that silence serves as a tool for intellect, control, and strategy, in addition to being a simple pause between sentences. We'll examine how this relates to relationships, the workplace, and even the most sensitive negotiations. This is about employing silence as a conscious control tactic, not about keeping quiet out of obedience. I'll demonstrate how to use this in your everyday life in the conclusion. No extreme life changes or pointless challenges, just a small, easy alteration that will alter how others perceive you. More significantly, your self-perception. Continue reading if you understand this. It's fascinating how one of the most potent kinds of presence may be silence, which at first glance appears to be absence. In our culture, speaking more, occupying more acoustic space, and showcasing your abilities are all considered ways to impose yourself. But if we pay close attention, people who are skilled at being silent hold real influence. It's a difficult paradox to embrace since it contradicts the idea that those who don't speak are unimportant. The contrary is frequently true in practice. Be mindful of everyday life. Someone always feels the need to talk non-stop during a work meeting. Silence bothers them, even if they have nothing important to contribute. Thus, they use clumsy language, superfluous justifications, or blatant statements to fill the gap. The leader is on the other side. And I'm referring to an attitude here, not a job title. The leader watches, listens, and waits for the ideal opportunity to speak. When they do, every word flows naturally like a well-planned chess move, a move that changes the game as a whole. Consider it. The impatient chess player responds rashly to what they observe and moves their pieces without forethought. Every action is a reflex rather than a choice. The careful player, meanwhile, studies the entire board before acting. After a protracted period during which they allow their opponent to become nervous, they make a single move that completely alters the situation. Silence can be a strategic pause, much like in chess. The observational area that highlights the game's weaknesses that nobody else notices. In interpersonal relationships, the same pattern recurs. When one family member demands to speak last, they become irritated, raise their voice, and begin repeating their points in an effort to win by sheer volume. You know that. Now contrast that with someone who hears the conclusion and, in a single sentence, ends the conflict. Silence has already prepared the emotionally stable person for the final word, so they don't need to compete for it. But why is this behavior occurring? Why is it that so many individuals feel the need to always talk? The solution is straightforward: uncertainty. People strive to fill the void with words when they feel threatened, as though attempting to convince others of their worth. However, people who are confident in themselves don't feel the need to prove anything. Knowing that there's no need to fill every blank space is the key to having true control. This reasoning is not new. According to Schopenhauer, external noise is an indication of inward instability. In a sense, words are no different. Anxiety or the fear of appearing unimportant are two examples of the mental chaos displayed by those who find quiet intolerable. Conversely, folks who are at ease with silence convey the opposite message: calmness, poise, and assurance. Thus, the next time you're speaking, listen carefully. Who is in charge? Who is it? The one who talks constantly or the one who watches in silence, meticulously analyzing every action before taking it? Now, consider, which would you choose to be? Being silent is more than simply not talking. Noise distracts, but presence, strategy, and control are key. quietness arranges. Few people are aware of how to intentionally employ the space it creates for perception. Because of this, a lot of tactical and philosophical writings stress the importance of stillness, or Sun Tzu, in the art of battle. All combat is taught to be founded on deceit. We must look weak when we are prepared to attack. Stated differently, silence does not equate to inactivity. It's the unseen prelude to the following action. Consider a job interview to have a practical understanding of this. The recruiter poses a difficult query. How would you settle a dispute with your supervisor? Two categories of candidates exist. The first answers right away, eager to seem effective, but in their haste, they make clumsy arguments. The second listens, stops for a few moments, and then gives a clear, unbiased response. Consider yourself the recruiter now. Which applicant would you choose to hire? Of course, the second one. Why? Because that pause expressed confidence and introspection. The time required for the response to be forceful and definitive was what caused the silence, not the lack of an answer. This reasoning holds true for negotiations as well. If you've ever participated in a negotiation for a purchase or sale, you may have seen that the first person to speak frequently loses in heated situations. It's practically an unspoken norm. The first person to speak up after an offer is made is typically at a disadvantage. The salesperson who notices the customer is silent and feels compelled to continue talking in order to maintain control of the situation is a prime illustration of this. They provide additional discounts or special terms in their haste. All of this occurs because the customer's quiet made them uncomfortable, even if they didn't request them. The same phenomenon can be observed in interpersonal conversations if we go outside of the professional realm. How often does one person get so uncomfortable with the other's quiet during a disagreement that they say more than is necessary? This deliberate quiet breeds skepticism, uneasiness, and eventually exposure. At that point, the silent party takes charge of the circumstance. Additionally, silence has symbolic meaning. In many cases, the silence speaks louder than 1,000 words. Has anyone ever engaged in conversation during a meeting? But all of a sudden, a single remark from someone who had been silent the entire time changes the topic of conversation. The individual who waited to speak restored the focus, as if the other sounds were simply background noise. In this instance, the tool that gave the statement's weight was silence. But why simply is quiet so potent? It defies continuous flow logic. Individuals are accustomed to a never-ending barrage of inputs, messages, and statements. That flow is disrupted by silence. It produces a void, a place where individuals must think. The other person feels obligated to fill the void left by your silence, but that void is not yours. It is theirs. Meetings, interviews, conversations, and even sales negotiations all exhibit this dynamic. Therefore, the next time you are in a scenario where you want to react right away, do the opposite. Hold on, don't hurry. Refrain from giving in to your discomfort, because understanding when and how to speak is frequently more powerful than saying more. Being undervalued can occasionally be the best position you can be in. This may seem counterintuitive, but it's a tried and true tactic. According to Sun Tzu, during a war, look feeble if you are strong. Look far away if you are close. This is neither submission nor cowardice. Strategic intelligence is what it is. People who don't pose a threat aren't observed very closely, while people who aren't watched are free to move around undetected. An archetypal illustration of this method can be found in philosophy. Socrates was an expert at pretending to be uninformed during arguments. He would pose straightforward queries and act as though he didn't know the answers, but in practice, he was leading the other person astray. Socratic irony is the term given to this tactic. With one well-placed question, he dismantled his opponent's entire line of argument after giving them the impression that they were in charge of the conversation. Socrates didn't have to be the most intelligent person. All he had to do was be the smartest. Clear instances of this can be seen in the current world. Imagine a manager that lets an intern offer solutions rather than always imposing their will. The supervisor had already thought of that route all along, but the intern thinks they had a great suggestion. The employer allows the intern to shine by not displaying their power, but in actuality, the person in charge was the boss the entire time. This isn't deception. It allows for delegation without sacrificing control. This type of person has one thing in common. They already know they are in power, so they don't feel the need to demonstrate it. Classrooms also exhibit this tendency. A student is frequently perceived as preoccupied or uninterested if they remain silent for the most of the lesson. After a while, they raise their hand and pose a question that everyone else was considering but was afraid to pose. The remainder of the class goes silent as the teacher turns to focus on that one student. What causes this to occur? Because the person who remains silent sets the expectation that they will have something significant to say when they do speak, and they typically do. In discussions, this is yet another typical instance. Individuals who overtalk and make an effort to seem intelligent frequently divulge too much about their hobbies. However, the one who doesn't seem to grasp or isn't in a rush takes advantage of. It's similar to the buyer who just watches a salesperson talk endlessly without saying anything. They appear unconvinced and do not turn down the offer. The consumer already knows they will receive a higher discount, and the salesman is frantically trying to seal the transaction. For this reason, the most skilled negotiators are adept at remaining silent. Often, the secret to obtaining more is to appear less interested. However, why does this work? The reasoning is straightforward. When around people who don't appear to be a threat, people often let their guard down. Consider a card game. People won't pay much attention to your movements if they believe you have a poor hand. This enables you to act when it's time to surprise them. Likewise, the inverse is true. All eyes will be on you, and every mistake will be noted if everyone believes you have the stronger hand at the table. Sun Tzu tells us precisely this. Freedom belongs to the strong who seem feeble. When weak people pretend to be tough, they reveal their weaknesses. Ask yourself, what do I gain by exposing myself right now? The next time you feel the need to prove yourself or demonstrate your intelligence, sometimes the best course of action is to come out as a little ignorant or uninterested. You're calculating every step, not because you're less capable. Silence is more than just a communication tactic, as Socrates, Sun Tzu, and really strategic leaders have taught us. Additionally, it serves as a tool for emotional self-control, because outside noise is heard and visible. Internal noise is frequently more difficult to detect, and it frequently causes us to lose control during conversations, disagreements, and confrontations. Being able to keep quiet when provoked is not a sign of weakness. It is the highest level of emotional regulation. Consider a disagreement between a couple. One of them becomes agitated, disputing constantly, and occasionally even yelling, but the other doesn't say anything. However, it's not a disdainful quiet. It's an attentive stillness. They don't respond immediately. They don't retaliate, they merely watch. What follows? The shouter begins to feel vulnerable. The other person's stillness becomes a mirror when they hear the echo of their own noise, further highlighting their lack of control. The individual shouting loses control of the situation at that time and frequently discovers this too late. This dynamic occurs in meetings at business as well as in personal relationships. The pattern keeps happening. It is assumed that if someone becomes impatient and speaks forcefully, the other person will do the same. The conflict intensifies if there is an instantaneous reaction, but the cycle is ended when there is silence. The other person's instinctive response is destabilized by that sudden stop. When someone loses patience, they frequently lose reason as well. Gandhi frequently applied the idea of self-control via quiet during demonstrations against British authority. Even when his followers wanted to strike back, he refrained from using violence, despite severe provocation. "Be the change you want to see in the world," he said. Gandhi's silence in this situation wasn't an omission. It was complete mastery over the want to strike back. Without uttering a word, his nonviolent struggle revealed the cruelty of his oppressors. But to get this, you don't have to be Gandhi. This reasoning shows up in everyday interactions. The individual who reacts in the heat of the moment during a disagreement with a coworker frequently says something they later regret. However, the individual who gives themselves permission to wait for a few seconds is able to come up with a more concise, forceful, and conclusive statement. One of the most common strategies in business discussions is this quiet passivity, isn't it? It's getting ready. The adage, "Whoever shouts loses their reason," is not a coincidence. The quietest person isn't necessarily correct, but those who can't control their inclination to blow up show that they've lost self-control. Additionally, losing self-control is ceding control to another person. The person in control of you is no longer you when you lose your temper. However, silence is not a state of emptiness. It demonstrates that the mind remains dominant. It's similar to pausing to take a deep breath before answering. This 10-second gap is frequently sufficient to prevent saying something that cannot be undone once it has been spoken. Everyone has experienced this. You say something without giving it any thought, and after a few minutes, you realize that waiting just 10 seconds would have allowed you to remain silent. That would never have come out of your mouth. Do you want to implement this? Try one easy thing the next time you're tempted to react right away. Breathe deeply, then count to 10. It may seem easy, yet it works amazingly well. This pause serves as a means of demonstrating to yourself that you still have control over what you're going to say. It is neither omission nor submission. It's self-control. What if the other individual persists in speaking, yelling, or pressing? Keep in mind that the most powerful cry for control isn't actually a cry, rather, it's the quiet that endures. Silence like this is not a sign of weakness. It is the pinnacle of strength. It takes no words to demonstrate that someone can remain emotionally composed in the midst of pandemonium. Being proud can be a burden that is passed off as strength. It frequently leads us to feel that, in order to be acknowledged, we must prevail in debates, demonstrate our intelligence, and have the final say. However, what do we actually stand to gain from this? If we examine it closely, we will discover that when pride is not controlled, it leads to unnecessary arguments and the loss of significant connections. A loop of power battles results from what could have been settled with a little moment of stillness. This was personally experienced by Schopenhauer, who is renowned for his critical perspective on human vanity. According to his own mother, he was unable to accept other people's viewpoints because of his academic pride. Because of his rigorous and logical perspective on the universe, Schopenhauer found it difficult to accept what he perceived as mediocrity in other people's viewpoints. His incapacity to tolerate others was frequently interpreted as conceitedness. These days, it's easy to identify this kind of pride. Consider that co-worker who refuses to accept correction or who escalates every argument into an ego battle. In professional settings, this is particularly evident. Consider a worker reprimanding their supervisor in front of the group. Even if an employee is technically correct, their posture may cause needless conflict. The supervisor frequently reacts with power rather than reason. This is an issue of authority relations more than merely the boss's ego. Now contrast this with the one who waits for the meeting to conclude and makes the remark privately rather than publicly correcting the boss. Even when the fix is made, the way it is received is very different. This situation is about pride and control more than it is about work. Here, strategic silence is not a sign of surrender. It's intelligence. It's sacrificing a short-term triumph in order to eventually attain a bigger one. Personal relationships follow the same reasoning. How often does the last person to speak in a disagreement amongst friends or partners feel like they won the discussion? However, did they actually prevail? Or were they simply the last to be unsure about when to cut off? Here, the reasoning is straightforward. Speaking out of pride has a cost, and the price is often higher than it seems. In the heat of the moment, we feel the urge to defend our position, but the next day, when the dust settles, that sense of victory often turns into regret. Many friendships and relationships are strained because someone insisted on having the last word, not because they were right, but because they didn't want to lose the argument. Lao Tzu, the Taoist sage, once warned, "He who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know." This idea doesn't mean that silence should be absolute, but rather that those who are sure of themselves don't need to prove it constantly. When you have clarity about who you are, you don't feel the need to fight for speaking time, to affirm your intelligence, authority, or relevance. Now take a moment to reflect. How many arguments have you lost simply because you wanted to have the last word? How many debates turned into unnecessary confrontations because no one was willing to give in? Pride works like this. It convinces you that you're winning, but in reality, you're only increasing emotional strain. And here's the key point. Silence is often the true antidote to pride, not because it defeats you, but because it interrupts the cycle of vanity that leads to endless conflict. The next time you feel the impulse to speak louder or have the last word, ask yourself, what am I really trying to win here? If the answer is to prove that I'm right, maybe it's time to stop. Not every victory is worth the fight, and silence in this case is not defeat. It's wisdom. Knowing when to speak and when to remain silent is a skill that can completely change how people perceive you. It's not about staying silent out of submission, nor about talking all the time to seem relevant. True power lies in the balance between the two. It's understanding that often, silence isn't the end of a conversation. It's the space where ideas mature. In family situations, for example, arguments often turn into a competition of voices. Everyone wants to win the conversation, have the last word, or prove they're right. Who hasn't experienced this? But take a closer look. How often do you see someone win a family argument by shouting and repeating the same points? What usually happens is the opposite. The more someone insists on having the last word, the more they lose control of the situation. Now, think of the person who, instead of trying to win, listens carefully, and when they do speak, drops a short, direct, and precise statement. The impact is completely different. Nobody argues with someone who delivers a simple, undeniable truth at the right moment. Another clear example is in friendships. Imagine a group of friends discussing a controversial topic. There's always that one person who feels the need to impose their opinion. This person doesn't listen to anyone, interrupts others, and refuses to accept counterpoints. In the end, the friends don't remember what they said, but how much they insisted on winning the conversation. Now, think about the friend who spends most of their time listening, but when they finally speak, they offer a perspective no one had thought of. This person doesn't need to impose anything, because their silence has already built anticipation. The key point here is timing. It's not about speaking less or more, but about knowing when to speak in certain situations. The rush to speak reveals insecurity. Have you ever seen someone who, when contradicted, responds immediately without even thinking? This happens because their discomfort with silence is stronger than their need to reflect. They just want to fill the void. But someone who is secure in their thoughts isn't in a hurry to justify themselves. They wait. They think, and when they speak, it's with conviction. A good way to know when to speak and when to stay silent is to ask yourself, does this need to be said right now, or can it wait? Often, what seems urgent in the heat of the moment fades after a few seconds of reflection. How many times have you said something and shortly after thought, I didn't need to say that? Now think about the opposite. How often have you regretted staying quiet? Usually, what wasn't said can still be said later, but what was spoken impulsively cannot be undone. Here's a simple practice for daily life with friends and family during a group conversation. Try to observe more and speak less. When you do speak, contribute something that hasn't been said yet. Not only does this make your words more impactful, but it also shows that you listen before you give your opinion. In arguments and conflicts, when you feel the urge to respond impulsively, pause. Count to 10 before speaking. That's it. This brief pause is enough to shift your brain from reactive mode to rational mode in text messages before replying to a message that upset you. Close the app for 5 minutes. Many arguments via text happen because of the rush to reply. Digital silence is also a form of control. Silence in this context is not just a strategy or a technique. It's a choice to avoid fueling tension. You don't have to do it all the time or use it in every conversation. But when you do, the impact is undeniable. After all, silence is not just an absence of words. It's a fertile space where ideas are given time to grow. Words have their value, but so does silence. It's not about deciding which is better or more effective, but about recognizing that silence, like words, can open new paths. Sometimes the impulse will be to speak. Other times, it will be to wait. There's no exact formula for this, and perhaps that's the whole point. You don't have to be in control all the time. Sometimes the pause isn't passive waiting. It's a method of letting time do its thing. Being silent has never meant remaining silent indefinitely. It's the presence of intention rather than the lack of voice. When someone speaks at the appropriate time, they are not being passive. They have power since they are dictating the conversation's tempo. Additionally, We have observed how this power manifests itself in several spheres of life throughout this reflection. In relationships, friendships, and the workplace, it turns out that silence works better than hurried speaking. Speaking more effectively is more important than speaking less. Numerous interruptions during a conversation can be less effective than a thoughtful remark at the conclusion. There is no mystery here, it is lucid. Here, the true message is straightforward. Silence and speech are not in competition. Both are necessary. Just as pauses give music its rhythm, silence gives words their impact. Your words become a genuine voice once you have mastered this alternation. Silence is a means to deal with yourself more than it is with the outside world. You start to realize what's going on inside of you when you stop responding to everything. A clarity that was previously absent appears amid the internal cacophony. Listening to what the world has to say is more important than trying to silence it. Silence does not have to be a rule or a method because of this. It's a choice, and if this reflection got you thinking, perhaps it's worth looking at. The power of that option is that it's yours. Consider the impact on both yourself and other people during the next few days when you decide to speak or remain silent.